KZSU-FM Stanford, welcome to another edition of Hearsay Culture. My name is Dave Levine. I'm a professor at Elon University School of Law, as well as an affiliate scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. Today, I'm delighted to have on the show the author of a book that's received quite a bit of attention, both prior to its publication and after it. The author is Laurie Woolever, and the book is Bourdain, the Definitive Oral Biography. Anthony Bourdain, as many people know, came to rise as the food culture came to fruition on television. From his book Kitchen Confidential about 20 years ago up through the launch of the Food Network, Anthony Bourdain was seen as, in many ways, the epitome of the growth of a culture around the issues, not just of food, but of the cultural relevance of food. How communities use food to come together, how the world can be understood through not just what people do, but how people share meals, how people discuss the world around them. And Anthony Bourdain was a master of telling these stories in a way that was authentic, but also challenging. Laurie Woolever worked with Anthony Bourdain more or less for about 20 years, and particularly very closely over the last 15 years. And in her book, Bourdain, she follows a very unusual method for writing. As we know, Tony Bourdain sadly passed away a few years ago by suicide. And in the wake of that tragedy, we saw Laurie interview 91 people who knew Anthony Bourdain well and who could tell his story using, and I'll use the cliche, warts and all. As Laurie points out in the introduction, this is not as much an extolation of a perfect human being, but a very real and honest discussion of someone who, as Laurie points out in the introduction, did a lot of good, did a lot of wonderful things, but was mortal and had situations where people were hurt. Through a very extensive, and we'll talk about this in the interview, process of weaving together 91 people, everyone from Anthony Bourdain's mother to people who knew him in the kitchen to people who knew him on the entertainment side at CNN and the Food Network, we get a very intimate portrait of an individual who lived his life as if what he was doing had to be the center of what people were focusing on. At the same time, he was a human being, and this comes through in the book. He was a person who felt a lot of emotion around both successes and failures. And Laurie tells a very interesting story of one particular early discussion with some members of the press, where the press walked away from a table where he was eating while he was in the bathroom, and the shock, right, of those people not being there. This was a person who felt personally, and at the same time clearly had felt that he apparently had a strong obligation to his public. Through our discussion today, I'm going to be talking with Laurie about the book, about the process, but also about the challenge associated with doing these kinds of interviews in the wake of Anthony Bourdain's tragic death, having known him so well. It's an amazing book. It's a book that reminds me, I will say, and listeners may want to look at Lincoln and the Bardo as a method for doing this kind of writing, in that she is weaving stories from other people's words. Laurie is joining us via Zoom today. Thank you, Laurie, for joining us on Hearsay Culture.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Let me jump in with a question which listeners have to be thinking about off the top, and then we'll dig deeper. You're writing about someone who you knew so well in the wake of a tragic death, right? Interviewing the 91 people that you spoke to. Talk to us a bit about that process and how you were able to get this information and weave it, given the personal connection that you had to Anthony Bourdain.
Yeah, it was about a 2.5-year process of doing interviews. And, I had the advantage of having worked with Tony as his assistant for close to a decade, and I had known him since 2002. So I had a really good starting place to work from. I knew a lot of the people who I wanted to interview. And those who I didn't know, or I didn't even know that I didn't know them, I was led to them by the people that I did know. And I had, to my credit, I guess, I had built up some trust and some credibility among the people that knew him, so that I think they were more willing to speak to me than they might have been to someone who was just a writer for hire. And there certainly have been those people making efforts to do their own biographical projects around Tony. And I understand he's a huge figure. He's a charismatic person with a tragic and mysterious death, and it is a very compelling story. But I think that, for me, it was important, and for Tony's publisher and his agent and the estate, it was important that someone who had a personal connection be one of the first out of the gate with a story that could be told in an honest and compelling way, with a lot of sympathy, but also very, unsparingly. So it was a difficult process, especially at first. I was in shock and experiencing the grief of the loss, and also the sort of questions about what my future might be. I mean, this was my job for close to 10 years, was working full time and being Tony's assistant. And so when somebody leaves this world, you don't, that's it. That's as far as, taking care of them in that way. So I started out from a place of deep, deep grief and confusion, and not even being sure that I would be able to execute the project. And over the course of many months and ultimately years, I felt that it was part of my grieving process to be able to speak with people who knew him, who could shed light on things that I didn't understand, or tell me stories that I didn't know. And I knew that would translate into a book that, for people who, even if they knew his work very well and felt that they were very well versed in all things Tony Bourdain, I knew there is a lot to be offered in this book that they don't know.
I appreciate your candor here, because I was thinking about this process in light of a song by Patty Griffin called Goodbye, where she writes about her thoughts about there must be better ways to say goodbye to people when they pass than what we do as human beings. And I'm wondering if this, in your personal view, is a way of saying goodbye to a man with whom you work so close, right? And obviously had such a strong relationship, and who obviously, as you talk about in the book, had so much trust and confidence and perhaps even love for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of an existential question, because he's gone. There really is no goodbye to somebody who made that decision to leave this world by their own hand. So I suppose in a way it's goodbye to the era of Tony Bourdain for me and for the world. I mean, he was a big part of American culture for, close to 20 years. So I think maybe more than a personal goodbye, it's a way to help all of those people who were left with so many questions about him and so much pain in the wake of his loss. Maybe it's a chance for them to say goodbye, or to let go a little bit, or just to understand a little bit more who he was, where he was coming from, and how a person who outwardly appeared to have the best life could find himself in such a dire predicament that he would choose to take his own life.
Of course, I wouldn't expect you, nor perhaps would you want to, speak for 91 people as to their thinking when you approach them. But I'm curious, from a process and also from a personal perspective, approaching these 91 individuals had to be a challenge in its own right? Because people might not know why you're doing this, or what you're doing, or what your intentions are. And obviously, on the other hand, the breadth of people that you spoke to is really quite remarkable. I'm curious if you could share a little bit more about how you approached people with this project whom you interviewed, right? Because I mean, talking to Anthony Bourdain's late mother might be very different than talking to someone who worked with him in a kitchen for a year or two 15 years ago. Share with us a little bit about how you did that.
Well, I would like to think that I approached each person with sensitivity and respect, certainly, obviously, someone like Tony's mother, whom I spoke with about 3 months after his death, it was I tried to be very cognizant of the fact that I was approaching a grieving mother, a woman who certainly did not expect her own son to die before the end of her life. I got an introduction or sort of I got the go ahead from Tony's brother, Christopher, who spoke with his mother in advance and sort of let her know what I was doing and that who I was and that I would treat the subject matter with the respect that it deserved. And so she was willing to speak with me on the phone. I was felt extraordinarily grateful to speak with her. She did die herself in January of 2020. So it was not a sure thing that I would get to include her voice. And I think it's really, really important that she's there. The same for people like Nancy Bourdain, who was Tony's high school sweetheart and became his first wife, and they were married for 20 years. She's a very, very private person. She really, from the time that Tony broke through with Kitchen Confidential, she really did not want to be in the spotlight, never gave a comment to anybody from the press, didn't appear on television, really valued her privacy. And again, I think because of the time that I spent working with Tony and because of the trust that his brother had in me, I was able to persuade Nancy to come and speak with me twice at length. And again, I really tried to respect that decision just by showing up very prepared. And by, if there was something she didn't want to talk about, I wasn't going to press. And maybe that's, that impacts the manuscript. If somebody, again, was coming in from a place of just strictly being a journalist for hire, doing a job for a publisher, they might be a little more aggressive in some ways. And, I've being personally invested in this story, I felt that it was really important to protect everyone, to help them process grief and not to add to their grief or add to their stress around this situation. And I think it's a case of, getting more flies with honey than vinegar. People were very, very generous in their recollections and what they were willing to share by and large. There were some people who said no, and I absolutely respect that. And there were some people who wanted to talk about this and not that, and you have to respect that too. So I think that even with those self-imposed limits, I think it still is a very revealing and very candid book that shares, in some ways, a warts and all perspective, like you said, about Tony and about exactly who he was.
We're chatting with Laurie Woolever, author of the book Bourdain, the Definitive Oral Biography, on KZSU-FM, Stanford, and Hearsay Culture. There's one notable voice that's missing, at least through the entire narrative, except the introduction, in a sense, which is yours, Laurie, right? It wouldn't have been implausible, it seems to me, right, to include your commentary even through the range of discussions. And by the way, I should note for listeners who haven't seen the book, this is a book that's over 400 pages. So this is not a book where you're having to find material, as it were. So I'm curious, other than the introduction and your acknowledgments at the end, your voice is really not there, except to the extent, of course, that you're editing the material. But I'm curious if you ever gave thought to the possibility or rejected the possibility of having your own commentary or your own annotation to the various insights and thoughts and experiences that people share.
Mm-hmm. It did come up. My editor, Daniel Halpern, did suggest it at one point that I ought to find someone to interview me and consider including those answers in the manuscript. So I did go through that process. I had someone interview me, and it was really useful. But ultimately, I felt that my memories weren't so important to sort of break that fourth wall in a way. My influence is on every page in having decided who to speak to and what questions to ask them and what parts of the conversation serve the narrative. There are a couple of places where I've done some interstitial writing. I wrote all of the chapter titles, and in fact, I chose the entire structure of the book came from me. So I don't feel that I am missing in this book. And maybe there's one or two stories that I, that are mine alone that don't make it into the book. But ultimately, I felt that, I don't know, it didn't feel exactly right for me to include my own anecdotes in there. But it was a very useful exercise to do. In fact, there was one person I interviewed who I wanted to interview, who was very reluctant to be interviewed. And the way that I kind of softened him up was to say, all right, well, I understand you're on the fence. Would you please interview me? And that would be a big help to me. And in the course of doing that interview of me, he really opened up and talked a lot about his own experience, and then later was comfortable enough to consent to an interview. So it was not a lost cause by any means, but at the end of the day, I felt that I didn't need to insert myself in a different way into this manuscript.
It's a, I think a somewhat, remarkable ability to be able to not, right, attempt to influence a story being told at this level of detail, given all of the personal knowledge that you have. And I'm wondering, as we turn to some of the insights that come from the book and the stories, whether in your conversations and in your interviews, you were finding yourself wanting certain kinds of answers or certain kinds of responses, or whether you kind of took the stories as they were. In other words, separating yourself as a writer and an editor versus someone who worked with Tony and knew him so well had to have been a huge challenge when you're interviewing 91 people, some of whom, as you pointed in the introduction, I pointed out, had things to say about Anthony Bourdain, which are not necessarily nice qualities about a person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Come up, yeah.
Well, I really wanted to just let people say what it is they were going to say. I knew Tony's origin story as he wrote it in Kitchen Confidential, and I knew all of the, major points of his career. And I had certainly spent a lot of time reading his books and watching him on television. So I came into it with a lot of knowledge, but I knew that there were a lot of backstories that I didn't know. So I didn't feel a sense of wanting to control that, because it was a process of discovery for me in a lot of ways. There were one or two interviews that I didn't end up including because they were both overwhelmingly negative, and also I did not necessarily believe that the person I was speaking with was a reliable narrator. Knowing the backstory, I knew that there was a lot of just not great intentions. And I did the interview to see what would happen. And ultimately I thought, this is not going to move the story forward. And this is only going to serve this person, again, who I wasn't convinced was a very reliable narrator. So I did make some decisions in that way, but overall, there were people who had mixed experiences with Tony. I mean, some of the guys that he knew from high school and that he spent time with in kitchens in the 80s and 90s, they had a clear love and respect for him. They were devastated by his death. And they also felt free to point out, yeah, this guy kind of left us behind. When he got famous and his life changed, he stopped returning our phone calls, and that hurt our feelings, So, and that's in the book. I mean, I didn't want to gloss that over. There's plenty of people who are saying, very true and kind things about what a great guy he was. But the fact remained is that, in his younger days and at the end of his life, he did hurt people and he did make bad decisions. And, he was somebody, in writing Kitchen Confidential, he was unsparing with others and equally unsparing with himself. He was not afraid to point out his own bad judgment and bad decisions and selfishness and things that he wished he had done differently. So it felt appropriate to include some of those things in this book as well.
We're chatting with Laurie Woolever, author of the book Bourdain, the definitive oral biography. Laurie, let's dig into some of these insights and stories. So in the beginning of the book, just interviewing, as you mentioned, Laurie's Anthony's mother, as well as a few others. One immediate thing that comes out is a thirst for knowledge, right, at a very young age. You quote Anthony's late mother as saying that he always had a fabulous vocabulary and that he read early. What do you make of those early, right, quests for information that seem to has run through his entire life?
Yeah, I think that was in part just an inherent personality trait, that he was just innately as a child drawn to literature, drawn to language, drawn to self-expression. And his friends talk about how the language that he used always made things sound better than they were. And he would, why use a plain word when you can use a funny, unusual word? I think one of the guys says, you didn't get in a fight, you ate shoe. He was such a voracious consumer of comic books and crime novels and kung fu films and all of these things with these heightened reality, was a lot of times with their own language, their own vernacular. And he was just a sponge for all of that stuff, and it was, those were forms that he tried to emulate throughout the years. So I think it was just one of those things that you're kind of born with or you're not, the soul of a writer and someone who really delights in language. Just recently, this is not in the book, but one of his friends, Joel Rose, who shows up quite a bit in the book, who was sort of a writing mentor to Tony, told me that at some point Tony bought a book about how to become a stand-up comedian and how to be funny. And it was, in some ways it's like either you're funny or you're not, but he was so invested in being a good storyteller and a funny, engaging storyteller that he was, taking this book very seriously. And he would tell Joel things like, apparently, words that start with the letter K are especially funny, or, all this little kind of strange advice about how to put phrases together for maximum impact. So this was a craft that it was both inherent to who he was and also something that he was constantly refining and constantly looking to be the best storyteller that he could be.
And indeed, you quote Hillary Snyder as saying Tony was always way more knowledgeable than skillful in terms of his cooking, which is a surprising statement, right? Given the subjects of all of his work. Do you agree with that assessment of him, that it was knowledge and that quest for knowledge that really defined what his skill set was, as opposed to the cooking itself, particularly in light of the fact that he wrote books like Kitchen Confidential that very much were about those things?
Yeah, I think that especially in those early days, I think the way for him to truly immerse himself in cooking was to become very conversant in the work of the French masters, right? And he was a voracious reader. And if he didn't have the skills by hand, he could certainly out-talk and out-learn and out-fact anyone around him, and I think that was always kind of part of his shtick. I think that, he was always very careful in life to say that he wasn't a great chef. He wasn't one of the, great creative minds of his time. And he had such a reverence for the people who really did hold that place or do hold that place. The late Jean-Louis Paladin was a hero of his, Paul Bocuse. And then, in contemporary times, his friend Eric Ripert and the chef Thomas Keller, he recognized the difference between those guys who had taken a very serious and very hardworking and very punishing path, and someone like himself who worked hard, went to the Culinary Institute, definitely put in his time, but always kind of chose the money and the glamour and the lifestyle over the hard nose to the grindstone type of cooking that creates a brilliant world-renowned chef like Eric Ripert. So I think he was a very good chef in the sense that he was very capable of leading a brigade of cooks. He was very capable of, feeding a full dining room on a Friday night that's been seated, 3 or 4 times over, and not screwing up an order. But he was the first to say, I was not creating anything new in my kitchen. I was executing a vision very, very well. So, and I think where he really shone, again, was with all of that knowledge, really understanding the history and the culture of the cuisine. And he loved the esoterica of French cuisine, the duck presses and all of the accoutrement, all of the little details. He really reveled in that stuff. And there's a great passage in there with his two friends in Montreal, Dave McMillan and Fred Morin, where they talk about the discovery that Tony also knows about, 6 different fish forks and all of these, these things, the lore of the table. That's it's not, you don't need to know it to be a great chef these days, but Tony really dug into it and they were into it as well. And that sort of became the basis of their friendship. So, he was a voracious reader about many, many subjects. He had a deep interest and knowledge in Cold War spy tactics between the US and the Soviet Union. He was deeply knowledgeable about the CIA. He was, one of the foremost amateur scholars of the Kennedy assassination. I mean, he really, if he was interested in something, he would go really, really deep. So that extended to cooking as well as many other passions.
What strikes me in reading the book was I kept thinking of him as a disruptor, right? He disrupted, right, flows, right, in good ways. And I'm curious what you think of that. Disruption is a word that we use a lot today in the context of technologies, right, and the world generally. But what do you say of Anthony Bourdain, the disruptor?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a 2000s and 2010s tech term for sure.
Yeah.
I don't know that I don't believe that he set out to disrupt. I think that he set out to express exactly his worldview and what was on his mind. And the fact that he did disrupt a couple of different landscapes was a wonderful coincidence. He published Kitchen Confidential in 2000 at a time when food writing was not that, and food media was not that. Everything was very surface level. Everything was very focused on luxury. We were just coming out of the, beautiful, prosperous Clinton years. And it was all about caviar and truffles and champagne and golf courses, and then here was this guy, talking about the seedy underbelly and things that really hadn't been discussed or hadn't been acknowledged in the mainstream for a very long time, arguably since George Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London, which was absolutely an inspiration for the work that Tony did. So he came along with his worldview at the right place at the right time. And it truly was disruptive. I mean, you talked about that story of, he was invited to some press lunch and he got up to either go use the bathroom or have a smoke. And when he came back, everyone had left the table. And this caused him a lot of hurt feelings. And I think his wife, Nancy, said, listen, you got to understand, like, you have totally shaken up these people's lives. They were absolutely untouchable. And, nobody was looking behind the curtain, and you tore the curtain down. So you have to understand if they don't trust you or they don't really want to be your friend because you've betrayed them in a way, So I think he also disrupted the television medium. The food and travel television was either dump and stir in a studio, which definitely has its place. And I think a lot of us miss that. And now it's all competitions and it's pretty much just competitions. But there was either, in 2000, it was dump and stir, or there was a little bit of travel. But again, it was very high level, very kind of glossy lifestyles of the rich and famous inspired travel television. And then here was this guy eating the live, the beating heart of a cobra, and spending time in grotty food stalls in Cambodia and Vietnam, and just really subverting the paradigm, so to speak. And again, I don't think he set out to say, I'm going to shake everything up. It was just, this is my worldview. This is what I'm interested in. And I think other people might be interested in it too.
We're chatting with Laurie Woolever, author of the book Bourdain, the ultimate oral biography on KZSU-FM, Stanford, and Hearsay Culture. For those of you that listen regularly, you know that KZSU is a nonprofit, non-commercial radio station at Stanford University that requires donations from listeners like you to continue its diverse programming. You can email our underwriting department at underwriting@kzsu.stanford.edu, or you can go to our website and click on donate to KZSU. Regardless, please keep listening. It struck me going back to this disruptor idea for a moment, and this quest to reveal information, right? The first jumping off point almost in the book is, and the first clip that you offer is from Anthony's brother Christopher, who points out, right, that we didn't know that our mother was Jewish. And
Yeah.
and I'm curious, just as a starting off point, it's a fascinating way to start. Incidentally, no secrets here. David Levine's a Jewish name, in case you were wondering, and I'm kidding around, right? But my question is this: it's always easy to make a lot of any story to find a conclusion, but it does seem like there were a lot of, if not secrets, right? Lots of things that in and the stories you tell that Anthony experienced personally that may not have been known by others, and moreover, his own life story appears to have been one that was not clear to him until much later. How much of that kind of, pulling, raising the curtain or revealing the truths, do you think drove him, in light of a pretty, amazing revelation that comes later about his own lineage and religious background?
Yeah, I think there were two distinct effects that it had on him. The first was that, yeah, I think he became interested in naked truth telling and conspiracies and revealing hidden truths and all of that. I have to believe that there's a connection between having part of his heritage kept from him by his mother and this desire to tell the truth. But I also think that it's an interesting through line from his mother obscuring this in order to present a certain face to the world, and Tony's own kind of very highly curated version of himself that his culinary colleagues talk about this idea that, yes, he definitely did do heroin and he definitely had a problem with heroin, but his pursuit of it and the aesthetics of it were very it was in the service of a persona that he found very compelling and that he wanted to create for himself. And somebody, I forget which of his colleagues said it, but it's this idea that there was always a little bit of distance between who he was and what the image that he wanted to project of himself. And heroin was a part of that. And the music that he was interested was a part of that. And his entire aesthetic, and even to an extent, the decision to leave college and go into the restaurant business. It was much cooler. It was sort of an outsider punk rock pirate ship. Choose your cliche, but those were some of the driving forces there. So I think that, yeah, there is a parallel there. Another thing that Tony talked to me about before he died, and that comes up in the book as well, is this idea that their family presented outwardly as a successful upper middle class family that was doing well, that undertook a big renovation on their home. They took a couple of very expensive and elaborate trips to France. They had an expensive foreign car. The boys both went to private school, and yet below the surface, they were really struggling financially. Everything that they put out in the world to present themselves as keeping up with the Joneses came at a great cost. They were constantly in debt to the school tuition, to the orthodontist. They ran out of money when they were renovating their home. And so the front entrance of the house was a disaster, but the rest of everything looked incredible. So I think, again, there's a parallel there. Present what you present to the world as, for instance, the world's most interesting man who travels everywhere and eats everything and is handsome and charismatic, and women are falling for him left and right. That covers up a person who was much more complicated than that, who was socially awkward and shy and lonely and sometimes very, very sad.
The ambition that drove him seemed to address that sadness. That quest to be outside of his own confines, outside of the United States, to go places where others hadn't gone in television as well as writing. And it struck me that one of the folks you spoke to referred to the kitchen as a, quote, dark place that one emerges from. And so I'm curious about that allegory, the kitchen as a dark place, working in the caverns, working in the proverbial salt mines, and whether that image, right, is an accurate reflection in your view of what that life is like.
I, to my mind, it's very accurate. As somebody, I went to culinary school, and it took me about 2 days to realize, oh, I don't want to do this. This is a very specific life, and if you love it, you love it, and it doesn't bother you that you don't see sunlight and you can't sustain healthy adult relationships. It doesn't matter because it's all there for you in the kitchen. But it's a young person's game, and you're never going to get paid what you're worth unless you're the top guy, and even then you're probably working so hard that you're still not really getting paid what you're worth. And I think that as much as Tony loved it, and he did love it, and he did speak with such reverence about the people that he worked with, and the sort of undescribable high of a great service, or being in that, when you're in that flow state on a Friday night in the kitchen and everything's working and nothing's going wrong and you can't believe that you're the captain of this incredible ship. All of that was true for him, but he also was desperate to get out of it, especially after 10, 15, 20 years, all of the ups and downs, owners making bad decisions and having to execute ridiculous visions, seeing restaurants fail. All of that was starting to weigh on him, plus the physical toll it takes on a person to be on your feet night after night after night, bending and reaching and lifting. And it's just, if you make it into your 40s and you're still working in a restaurant kitchen, you're pretty beat up, and that was the place he was at when he wrote Kitchen Confidential. And so I think there was a long game idea always to write himself out of the kitchen. And he tried, he had 2 books that he published before Kitchen Confidential. And the idea was maybe to break through with those and to get out of the kitchen. And they were moderately successful as far as, crime novels by unknown authors go, but in no way did they financially set him up to stop cooking. And it really was the fluke success of Kitchen Confidential was the only thing that allowed him to leave the kitchen behind.
There are a lot of contradictions in Tony Bourdain, and I'm curious which one strikes you as the most revealing as to who he was as a person.
That's a tough question. I mean, I think it is that, as I mentioned before, this sort of man who had the coolest job in the world, who seemed to have figured it out and beat the system. And I think there's a part of that is very real. I think he truly loved what he did as far as making television, getting to be kind of a filmmaker. I think he had so much fun getting to pay homage to, or in some cases, just rip off shot for shot some of his favorite films and some of his favorite directors. I think there was a true joy in that. But I think there was also so much ambivalence that it didn't necessarily, it wasn't overtly expressed. But I think in retrospect, and some of the people that I spoke with in the book say this outright, that it was that ambivalence and that discomfort with being on television that actually made him such a compelling television presence. And I think that really gets at the heart of Tony. He wanted to express himself. He wanted to keep moving forward and to do as much as he could and sort of really hang on to that brass ring. And yet there was this part of him, this older part, that was a little bit embarrassed by the nature of television, by the nature of his own fame. The worst thing in the world was him having to do what he called a dog and pony show, the necessary evil of promoting a new season of television or whatever it was that he had to promote. He knew he had to do it. But it took a lot out of him, to give the same answers to, 20 interviewers in a row or whatever it was. He could do it. Like he was such a pro, but, he would much rather be writing, be doing something original and not having to sort of dance the dance that everyone has to do.
We're chatting with Laurie Woolever, author of the book Bourdain. The contradiction that jumped out at me in addition to the one you mentioned, comes out late in the book, although it's reflected in the book, where one person pointed out that Tony Bourdain could be both self-involved and empathetic, and those definitely strike one as contradictions. And what's your response to that? The self-absorbed empath.
Yeah, in his life, I didn't necessarily see it in those terms, but now it seems it's so obvious to me, and it was absolutely my experience. I knew that, and he would say as much about himself. He said, I'm never going to remember people's birthdays. I'm not necessarily going to remember your kids' names, or I'm just not the kind of friend that's going to be there with those details, giving that kind of support as a friend day to day. It's just not possible, given that I am back and forth around the world all the time. I'm just not capable of that kind of friendship. But at the same time, he was extraordinarily empathetic. If somebody went to him and had a problem or had an issue, he would listen. He really understood, and he would offer whatever it was that he could to be helpful. When my marriage was coming apart, I just said to him, listen, I'm having a hard time. I'm going to be moving out of my apartment. And, without a second thought, he was like, I got you. Don't worry about it. If you ever want to talk about it, I've been through it. And, whatever you need in terms of getting, get a good apartment. Don't get just what you think you can afford. I'll help you. He didn't have to do that. I mean, he was paying me well. I had health insurance. I had all kinds of opportunities working for him. And that was just sort of second nature. He was very, very willing to share the wealth. And I think where the empathy really served, not me personally, but the world, is the way that he could go into an interview situation on television and, sit down with people with whom he had very little in common in terms of socio-political, economic, geographic, situations. And he could ask really smart questions because he had taken the time to learn about what was going on with these people's lives, and really listen and really give them the space and the time to talk about what it is to be someone living in, post-Gaddafi Libya, or, Iran, or wherever it was. He really, he was a great listener, because, and not, I think just because he had to be, just not because it was his job. He could have chosen a much easier job. He could have done the cooking competition thing full time, or just the luxury travel thing, but he really wanted to use his platform to shine a light on a lot of the injustices in the world.
And which does lead Laurie to another area that I want to focus on, which is his travels throughout the world on Parts Unknown, and his exposure to the worst of humanity. One of the folks you speak to refers to the, quote, weird colonialism, unquote, that he observed. And it seemed like those experiences with poverty, right, with violence, that were not ones that he sought as much as occurred because of his travels, had a profound effect on his worldview and even his behavior and personality. Can you talk a little about that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there were times where he wanted to do the right thing. The example, I believe it's in the book, and I know that it's also in the film Roadrunner. In 2010, Tony and his crew went to Haiti, and this was shortly after there was that terrible earthquake that was so devastating, especially in Port-au-Prince. So this was still when they were making no reservations. It was close to the end of the no reservations days, and this was by far the most challenging shoot they had done, geographically, politically, for their own comfort level, and also to be able to get to an agreement with the network on what they would deliver as far as a travel show, because I don't think anyone was thinking you should go be a tourist in Haiti right now. That's not what they need. What they need is aid, and they need a light shown on their plate. So what happened there was everyone was having a hard time in the wake of the earthquake, and things weren't great for people in Haiti even before that. So there was a scene where Tony was interviewing a woman who was cooking and selling food in sort of a tented area. And she was saying that, business is bad, nobody has any money. And while they're talking, they're being surrounded by more and more young men, boys and young men who are clearly very hungry and sense the opportunity to maybe get some food, from this white American television host. And so Tony says at the end of the shoot, listen, we've got all this leftover food. Why don't we just buy it and distribute it to the crowd? And so they started to do that. But it became a really chaotic, violent, and really uncomfortable situation where there wasn't a clear system of distribution. There may not have been enough food for everyone who was gathered there. And it got really ugly. And he felt responsible for that. In trying to do something benevolent, it turned into something really, really ugly where kids were getting hit by bigger kids and people still walked away without food. And it was, he felt responsible. There was a similar situation in, I believe it was Mozambique, where they had they were on a train and they were met by children who were really, really hungry and just kind of swarming them, because you see these relatively well-fed looking Western tourists come through and you figure, well, they got to have something. They're going to give me some money. If you're truly at a lack for food, there's a desperation there. So that was always a really painful reality of going to places where, where just finding enough food is a daily concern for people. And what it means to sort of chop her in and do your story and chop her out. And I'm sure this is something that's shared by any journalists that go into war-torn areas, famine-stricken areas. You start to think about who am I serving here? Why am I here? And am I making things any better at all for the people who are sharing their stories with us?
It's having lived a life as Tony did. Another big theme that comes through is the old, saying about, a life worth living is one that you experience, right? That you don't walk away from experiences, but you dive deep in. And I'm wondering if you think in retrospect that Tony, for lack of a better phrase, took more dives than he was healthy, or took more risks and opportunities than one could reasonably be expected to do. I know in hindsight, his tragic decision might seem to give an easy answer, but your book paints a much more complex portrait of the man. So I'm curious if at the end of it all, he pushed himself too far, or whether you think that he shouldn't have.
Well, yeah, it is complex, and it's really, I guess it's for every reader to decide. I mean, he wouldn't have been who he was if he didn't, live life to 1,000%. Although, to be fair, there were ways in which he was quite reasonable. Toward the end of his life, he was making sure that his health was in order. One of the last times I saw him, I picked him up from getting a colonoscopy, because they don't allow you to take yourself home after the anesthesia. So he wasn't like, there's this famous quote of his about, your body isn't a temple, it's an amusement park, enjoy the ride. And he certainly lived, a lot of his life that way, but he wasn't trying to be, Iggy Pop, or although Iggy Pop himself really kind of pulled back and now is, into working out and drinking juice and probably takes a lot of naps. Tony lived his life in a lot of ways to 1,000, as an addict, as someone who, if he was into something, he was into it 1,000,000%, so I don't know, would he have done the work that it took to write Kitchen Confidential had he not been so hell-bent on telling this story and on being a published writer? Yeah, he got really tired toward the end, and plenty of people said, look, you can pull back. And I think he was on the one hand, looking for ways to pull back and looking for ways to travel less and to be less exhausted. On the other hand, I think it was terrifying, the idea of pulling back, of not having that thing that had sort of defined the last part of his life, being a television travel guy, if you're not constantly running into and out of home and into and out of all parts of the world, then you have to sort of sit and be quiet and face your own demons. And I think there's a case to be made that if he couldn't really sit still. One of his directors, Nick Brigden, says in the book, Tony had to move to survive. He was like a shark. And I think that really it kind of sums it up. So I don't know. I think his deep interest in romantic love and the way that he prioritized romance and love in that way above almost anything else. I mean, that is also a through line throughout his entire life. You see that he managed to graduate high school a year early so that he could follow his girlfriend to college. And, he married his second wife, Ottavia, kind of on a whim, because she got pregnant. And it was, if he didn't have a settled romantic life, the rest of it was very hard for him to derive pleasure from. So the work was there. He really loved his daughter. He really, he had a lot of good friends, but the romantic thing was kind of above all for him.
Laurie, in the remaining few minutes we have left, I want to come full circle and refer you back to your prior book, World Travel, which you call an irreverent guide. The Guardian quoted you as saying that it had been a wrenching, lurching struggle to get back to the World Traveler manuscript. And then you wrote Bourdain. So, at one level you could say glutton for some level of punishment. On the other hand, right, where you point out that Tony Bourdain's life, having been ended by his own hand, makes his life now a complete body of work. I'm curious about that lurching, wrenching struggle, and where it puts you going forward with regard to not only Tony Bourdain, right, but your own world as a writer.
Yeah, World Travel is in some ways a much lighter book, and it's sort of it's more of an entertainment. There aren't answers to questions about Tony's death. It's really sort of a celebration of the work that he did as a television travel host. I found it extraordinarily difficult because we had started writing it together. It was a project I was really excited to collaborate with Tony on. We had written a cookbook together that was published in 2016. So I already knew what that process would be like. And I was really looking forward to doing this with him. So then to be not too far into the process and suddenly have him gone was a very, very difficult, extremely lonely thing. This was not a book for which I had to do a lot of talking to other people. I did some. I definitely leaned on some of his producers and directors for details and inspiration. But by and large, this was a very solitary process. And knowing what it was supposed to be it was just very, very sad. I was processing grief alone, and it was hard. So I'm very proud of that book, and I think the joy shines through. But those were some really tough months of sitting by myself in my living room with stacks of books and watching old episodes and trying to work through the grief. So as far as my future as a writer, I am working on a cookbook with a British baker named Richard Hart, who spent about 6 years as the head baker at Tartine in San Francisco, and now has his own bakery in Copenhagen called Hart Bakery, and it's under the auspices of the Noma Group. So working at a very high level there with some really amazing people. And so we are writing a book about bread that I hope will become the next essential bread book for people. And I've got a lot of my own stories to tell. I've been a writer for a long time, and it hasn't always been a financially rewarding proposition, but I'm continuing to sort of write down all my memories and my stories with and without Tony, and and hoping to get out. And also finally, when COVID continues to recede, as I hope it will, I'm hoping to get out and do sort of a late book tour and do a lot of speaking around the country. So hopefully after the first of the year, that'll happen as well.
So I certainly look forward to more of your writing, and I'll close with this question. Yeah, I have two sons. They're 12 and 14. As a father, it was very moving and very revealing for me to read your book, in light of the fact that Tony obviously left children. And I'm curious if you were to hand this book to a 14 or 15 or 16-year-old boy, right, who's inquisitive, who wants to live life, right, who's open to experiences as Tony was, and you said, read this, what would you want them to take from having read the life of this incredibly complicated, but also very giving man?
Yeah, I mean, I have my own 12-year-old son, so that's something, and he hasn't written it. I'm sorry, he hasn't read it. I guess I would say that, to take away the positive, being, to develop your craft, to be true to your own voice, all those things that Tony was. He didn't make popular television right out of the gate. He wrote a book not knowing if it was going to hit with anybody or if it was just going to be interesting to his kitchen colleagues, but it was something that really did hit because he was so true to his own voice. And I guess the cautionary tale side of things would be to recognize that it's okay to ask for help, to recognize that even if somebody looks outwardly like they're really, really thriving, just to recognize that everyone's got their own struggles and their own pain. And again, that's kind of a cliche, but I think it's very true. I think that there's an expectation that if somebody is, looking amazing on Instagram or has a success, it doesn't mean that they're not a sensitive person with struggles. And I think that can make us feel a little bit better and more comfortable about our own discomfort and our own struggles in the world.
Laurie Woolever, author of the book Bourdain, the definitive oral biography, published by HarperCollins. Thank you so much for your candor. Thank you for your work. Thank you for helping us understand Tony Bourdain. And I am grateful for you spending time today with my listeners on Hearsay Culture.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to Hearsay Culture, which is on Fridays at 3 p.m. Pacific time right now on KZSU. As always, you could find out more about the show by going to hearsayculture.com and look for exciting expansion of the program coming into 2022. Thank you for tuning in today to the show. Thank you for tuning in to KZSU. Please stay tuned for more diverse programming and have a great day.